Hello everybody, welcome to the final week of material for CRM 715. Paper 3 is due this week, then next week is your second exam, and then you have a few days the week after that to work on your final papers, and then final paper is due May the 9th, so things are wrapping up really quickly. So this week we're going to talk about organizational change. Now organizational change is really important topic because the simple fact is organizations have to change or they'll die or cease to exist or become irrelevant. Now, how often and to what degree organizations need to change? Well, it depends on the type of the organization, and the environment within which they operate. Obviously, if you're a tech company, you've got to be on the forefront. You got to be changing all the time. You know, if you're a policing agency, it's a little bit different, or some kind of government entity. So really the environment within which an organization operates really does impact how often and to what degree it needs to change. So criminal justice organizations do need to change, but one of the issues of criminal justice organizations is that they're notoriously difficult to change. Now, I mean, obviously, if you look through the course of policing history, police organizations have changed quite a bit, but it doesn't happen easily, and it usually takes quite a bit of time. All right, so organizations, if you'll recall, made up of individuals and groups, and they all exist within an environment. Any or all of those may be a catalyst for change, or any or all of those could also thwart any organizational change. Okay, so organizational change can kind of come from anywhere. So let's start real broad here. There's two broad types of change: evolutionary change and revolutionary change. Evolutionary change is more this incremental, continuous, first order kind of change. This is typically, subtle or minor changes to the organization over time. And this change also normally doesn't really affect the whole organization at any one time. Okay, it usually just affects small portions of the organization because you're talking about just subtle or minor changes. Revolutionary change, on the other hand, is episodic, discontinuous. It's called second order change. This type of change is usually in response to some type of episode or event that occurs, some kind of crisis a lot of times. So this type of change will abruptly change the organization, sometimes to its very core. Now, if you think about how these two types of change come about, revolutionary change is going to be much more stressful on the organization, its individual, and the individuals within it. Because it's not incremental, it's not subtle, it's not minor, right? This is big time change coming at you really quickly. So fortunately, it doesn't happen very often. Revolutionary change is not something that's happening all the time. But when it does, it really shocks the system. So evolutionary change, revolutionary change can both be in response to certain conditions or events. But how they respond to those events much different. All right, so how do you explain how and why organizations change? Well, if you get into literature, you do any reading about organizational change, there's a ton of theories out there. Theories after theories after theories. But we're going to focus on the theories proposed by Van de Ven and Poole that characterize these theories as motors for change. What does a motor do? A motor moves something. So these motors are moving change. The first one is a planned change. Now, planned change obviously is the best and least disruptive form of change. Right? It's planned out. So you're talking about things that have a repetitive sequence of goal formation, implementation, evaluation, and modification, right? It's planned out. Starts with an exploration stage where the initial problem is explored, right? What kind of solutions are there? Those types. Let's find out what we know about it. So then it moves into the planning stage, and that ends with the action stage. So you've got research, planning, action. Like I said, these can be in response to some type of event, but it's generally not a crisis, which would require a quicker type of change. Oftentimes, planned change takes quite a bit of time. So an example would be a police department that decides to implement community policing, not because some event happened requiring the change, but because administration or the city council or whoever decided that it would be the best method of policing. So over the course of time, administrators put into place through a series of steps everything necessary for the organization to transition to community policing. And that would happen in small doses, right? Eventually it affects the whole organization, but each time a change happens, it's not wholesale to the organization. So when you think about plan change, this type of change appears to be completely rational. But in order to be rational, they would have to require all possible knowledge, all possible alternatives, and all possible consequences have to be identified. So really, no change can ever be completely rational. But plan change is about the closest thing to rational change is what we have. So because it's impossible for it to happen in a rational change, it's actually called bounded rationality, where decision makers make the best decisions they can within some kind of boundaries, whether it be limited information, limited time. There's something putting a boundary on when the decision has to be made. So the second motor is called conflictive change. Now this one is predicated on the idea that structures, goals, etc. are seldom permanent. And there's different ideas about how an organization should be structured, what the goals should be, right? There's some kind of conflict here about what the organization should look like or do. So change occurs when people, those that oppose the current state of being have enough power or influence to challenge the commonly held assumption. So the people that want to see the change finally get enough power to try to make it happen. Now, this could be in reaction to some type of events or a series of events, or it could be imposed through the courts. One of the ways that courts introduce change in the criminal justice agencies is through legislation and consent decrees. Right? You've heard a lot about consent decrees in the last few years, whether it's Baltimore or Ferguson. Right? The court has used consent decrees to enact change within some organizations. So both of those, either legislation or consent decrees, can make demands on organizations to change how they're operating. All right, third stage is a life cycle stage. So this stage says, look, just like people, organizations pass through a series of stages through their lifespan. So even though organizations are passing or progress through stages, unlike people, there really isn't a set number of stages they have to move through, and really no particular time frame through which they have to pass each stage. You know, obviously, people progress through stages in their life. It begins with birth and ends with death. Well, they say organizations kind of look the same way, right? An organization's born, moves through these different steps, and then it eventually dies. But there's nothing that says that organizations have to, right? Nothing says organizations have to die or have to fail. Okay, so that's one of the criticisms of this type of theory, is that this theory assumes that organizations at some point will die. But it is possible for organizations to navigate various stages and still continue to survive. But the important thing about this theory is that it puts organizational change and decision making over a continuum of time. The other ones don't seem to do that. Okay, so this one's important because it actually says, look, this stuff happens over time. This isn't just a snapshot of an organization. An organization's changing, they're making decisions, all that stuff is happening on this continuum over time. All right, so the final motor is called the evolutionary motor. And this, if you had to change the name of this, we would call this survival of the fittest. All right, if you have organizations in a given population, for example, policing organizations or corrections organizations, they're going to exhibit variation in their structure and activities. Some of these variations are more advantageous than others. Those that have the better structure and have the more advantageous structures and activities will do better. Those that don't, they won't. So organizations that are at a disadvantage, they don't have the best structure, or they have something else that's holding them back, they can change their structure or activities to adhere more closely to what the environment is requiring. One of the problems is, though, organizations don't change quickly most of the time. So even though they decide that they're going to change to adapt to this new structure, say, by the time they do it, it may not be relevant anymore because something else may be necessary for that to happen. Now, criminal justice organizations aren't a great example of this. They do have a pretty good example of it in the book. Um, but private sector organizations certainly have evolutionary change. All right. So those are 3 or 4 kind of basic theories, and they all sound pretty good, right? In theory. But no change ever happens exactly like it's planned or like administrators would like. Why? Because there's impediments to change. People will sometimes resist change. Because if you're doing an organizational change, you're going to be asking organizational members to do things that they may not want to do. Or they have to adapt new ways of doing things, take on new duties, right? There's going to be different things that they're going to have to do that maybe they didn't have to do before. So one of the biggest challenges when you're promoting organizational change is the organizational culture. Because the culture's entire job is to promote a certain way of doing things, and organizational change threatens that. Another impediment to change is often unions. Union contracts are binding and are often very difficult to change. Now, if you just get to the individual level, there are many, many reasons why individuals may resist change. Some of those reasons are pretty concrete and rational, while others are more based on emotions. Emotional resistance is the most difficult to deal with because it is much harder to detect and much harder to offer solutions. And it varies very much so from person to person to person. Okay? If you have, for example, someone resisting change because they believe their work hours will have to change and they may not be able to pick their child up from school. Okay, that's a very clear, concise, concrete reason why somebody would resist a change, and that could be the same for several people, right? So something like that could pretty readily be addressed by administration. But if you have somebody that's resisting change because they just don't like when things change, because they're afraid bad things might happen, that's a much harder thing to address for administrators. It's a much harder thing to deal with because how do you fix that? Right? The first example you could say, well, fine, your schedule won't change. You can work the same hours, or we'll figure it out, and you can work whatever schedule so you can still get your child from school every day. But if you're dealing with someone who just says, well, I don't like change, and I'm scared bad things are going to happen, it's impossible to get that person to believe that bad things won't happen because there's no way to provide evidence for that. Okay, that's a very, very difficult situation to have. But those are the kinds of things that are sometimes impediments to change. But regardless of the why, administrators and especially your first line supervisors must make sure to spend whatever time is necessary and what effort is necessary to address those impediments to change and to do it as early as possible. Now, if you're going to plan change, some of these things should be addressed right off the bat. Right during the early planning stages, somebody should be thinking about, well, why would people resist this change? What kind of impediments to change should we expect moving forward with this change? And then build in solutions to that change. But regardless, impediments to change can derail a change effort really, really quickly. It only takes a few people to get other people on board with resisting change, and at a certain point, sometimes it cannot be overcome. All right, so congratulations. You're at the end of the course materials for this course. So please let me know if you have questions as you prepare to take your exam or finish your papers. Good luck next week.